The Arizona night was as black as a closed coffin, a suffocating velvet pierced only by the distant, indifferent glitter of scattered stars. A woman's breath tore from her lungs in ragged, desperate gasps as she fled across the desert floor, the soles of her bare feet shredded and bleeding from 1,000 sharp encounters with stone and thorn. Her copper-red hair, a banner of defiant flame against the oppressive dark, streamed behind her. Abigail Rossi had not survived 7 years in the unforgiving wilderness by being easily caught, but on this night, fortune had finally turned its back on her. The distant baying of hounds grew louder, a mournful promise of her doom, and the thundering hoofbeats behind her closed the distance with merciless mechanical determination. A sliver of cold moon slid from behind a bank of clouds, painting the stark landscape in ghostly silver and cruelly exposing her flight. Her foot caught on a hidden rock, and she went down hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs in a painful rush. Before she could claw her way back to her feet, they were upon her. Rough, calloused hands seized her, dragging her upright, binding her wrists with a coarse rope that bit into her raw skin like a serpent's fangs. "Well, well," a man's voice, thick with smug satisfaction, dripped into the silence. "The devil of Red Rock Canyon. Not so fearsome now, are you?" Abigail spat at him, the coppery taste of blood sharp on her lips. The blow came with brutal speed, a backhand that snapped her head to the side and made a constellation of stars explode across her vision. 7 years, another voice intoned, filled with a grim sense of righteousness. 7 years you've stolen from honest folk and terrorized this territory. That ends tonight. As they dragged her toward their horses, Abigail's wild green eyes, burning with an unquenchable fire, scanned the horizon. For 7 years, this brutal, beautiful wilderness had been her only sanctuary, the harsh cradle of her freedom. Now it stood as a silent, impassive witness to her capture, offering no shelter, no path of escape. The town of Silver Springs. A dusty collection of clapboard and wishful thinking buzzed with a feverish excitement under the scorching afternoon sun of August 1882. Word had spread faster than a prairie fire. They'd caught her. The red-haired devil, the witch of the canyons, the savage who had eluded capture for 7 long, frustrating years. The townsfolk, their faces flushed with a mixture of anticipation and the oppressive heat, gathered in the sun-baked square, hungry for judgment. Children too young to understand the gravity of the occasion, but caught up in the communal fervor, were hoisted onto their fathers' shoulders for a better view. Women clutched each other's arms, their whispers a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, eager to finally glimpse the infamous creature of their campfire stories. Sheriff Harlow Montgomery stood on the hastily erected wooden platform in the center of the square, his tin badge gleaming in the harsh sunlight. At 55, he carried himself with the weary authority of a man who had seen far too much of human darkness. Yet his voice when he spoke rang out strong and clear. "Citizens of Silver Springs, today marks the end of a reign of terror that has plagued our territory for too long." The crowd roared its approval, a collective thirst for justice, or perhaps simple vengeance, making them forget the sweltering heat that shimmered above the cracked earth. For 7 years, this woman has lived like an animal, stealing from honest homesteaders, threatening those who crossed her path. And yes, his voice dropped ominously, taking the life of a bounty hunter sent to bring her to justice. From the deep shadows of the jailhouse, 2 deputies emerged, dragging between them a figure that barely resembled a woman at all. Her red hair, matted with dirt and wild with tangles, hung like a tattered curtain around a face smudged with grime and marked by a fresh, blooming bruise across one high cheekbone. Her hands were bound before her, the ropes connecting to heavy shackles at her ankles. Her green eyes, however, burned with a fierce, untamed intelligence that utterly belied her savage appearance. The crowd fell silent for a heartbeat, a collective intake of breath. Many had expected some monstrous, hulking creature, not this slip of a woman, who couldn't be more than 25. Then the whispers began anew, a sibilant tide of speculation and superstition. They say she eats human flesh. I heard she bewitched a man's cattle to walk right off a cliff. My cousin's friend saw her dancing with demons under the full moon. Sheriff Montgomery raised a hand for silence, the gesture tired but effective. By the power vested in me, I declare this woman known to us only as the red-haired devil, to be auctioned to the highest bidder. The proceeds will be used to compensate those she has wronged and to pay for the proper burial of Travis Hodge, the bounty hunter, whose life she so brutally took. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. An auction, not a hanging. "Sheriff," a voice called out from the throng, "why not just hang her and be done with it?" Montgomery's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Justice takes many forms, Mr. Peterson. The territorial governor believes this creature can be rehabilitated through honest labor. Who am I to question his wisdom?" The explanation satisfied few, but the promise of a spectacle quelled any further objections. "The bidding starts at $20. The crowd pressed closer, a suffocating human tide, as voices called out bids, each offer accompanied by a public declaration of the bidder's intentions for such a notorious purchase. 25. I'll have her breaking rocks at my quarry until she's too worn out to cause any more trouble. 30. My boys will keep her in line. She'll learn civilization or she'll feel the whip. 40. I'll put her in a cage. Folks can pay a nickel to see the savage woman of the West. Throughout it all, the woman stood unmoving, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the jeering crowd, as though she were not present at all. It was a survival skill honed through years of unimaginable suffering to retreat inward to become a fortress of one. From the back of the gathering, a tall figure observed the proceedings with a look of increasing disgust. Mason Blackwood's steel-blue eyes narrowed beneath the wide brim of his black hat. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who had built his own legacy from nothing but dust and determination. A long, faded scar ran down his right cheek, a permanent, silent reminder of the price he had paid for that legacy. As the owner of the Whispering Pines Ranch, one of the largest and most prosperous spreads in the territory, Mason was respected, even feared by some, but he was rarely understood. He had come to town for supplies, not to witness this public degradation disguised as justice. The bidding continued, growing more heated as two men became particularly invested in the outcome. $60, shouted Wallace Thornton, a wealthy and powerful landowner whose cattle empire had been built through means few dared to question. His fleshy face was flushed with excitement as he eyed the woman on the platform like a prized mare. "I'll make her the main attraction at my traveling show, the Tamed Devil Woman of Arizona." 70 countered another voice belonging to a ranch hand known for his cruelty to both animals and women. 80, Thornton's voice boomed, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "And worth every penny to show what happens to women who forget their place." The woman's eyes finally snapped to Thornton's face. A flash of pure, undiluted hatred darkened her features, a look so intense it was almost a physical blow, before she just as quickly composed herself, retreating once more behind her mask of indifference. 90, cried the opposing bidder, but his voice lacked conviction. $100. Thornton's triumphant shout silenced the crowd. He stepped forward, already reaching for his wallet. "She's mine." $300. The quiet, firm voice cut through the charged atmosphere of the square like a knife. The crowd parted, a sea of startled faces, turning to stare at Mason Blackwood as he stepped forward, his expression as unreadable as the stone cliffs that bordered the territory. 300, he repeated, his steel-blue gaze meeting Sheriff Montgomery's startled one. "Cash." Thornton's face contorted with rage. "Now see here, Blackwood." "Do I hear 350 Montgomery?" interrupted suddenly, eager to conclude the proceedings and avoid a direct confrontation between the two most powerful men in the region. Thornton glared at Mason, then back at the sheriff. "This is irregular. I had the winning bid." "The bidding continues until I say it's done." Montgomery replied, his gaze carefully avoiding Thornton's. 300 going once." "You have no use for such a creature." Blackwood Thornton hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Unless you've developed unusual tastes in your solitude." Mason didn't deign to respond, his gaze steady on Montgomery. "Going twice." 350 Thornton spat his face, turning a blotchy shade of purple with anger. 400 Mason countered immediately, his voice calm and even. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the price climbed far beyond what anyone had anticipated for a half-wild criminal. At $500, Thornton finally backed down, his eyes glittering with a promise of future retribution. "Take the devil, bitch," he snarled. "You'll regret it soon enough." Mason approached the platform, counting out the bills from a worn leather wallet. As he handed them to Montgomery, he spoke in a low voice that only the sheriff could hear. "She didn't kill that bounty hunter, did she, Harlow?" Montgomery's eyes widened fractionally before he quickly controlled his expression. "What are you talking about?" "There were witnesses." "I'm sure there were," Mason replied evenly. "Just as I'm sure those witnesses saw exactly what they were told to see." The sheriff's face paled slightly. "You're buying trouble, Mason, more than you know." "Wouldn't be the first time." Mason turned to the woman who was studying him with a wary, intense curiosity. "Remove those chains." One of the deputies hesitated, looking to Montgomery for confirmation. The sheriff, caught in the cross-current of two powerful wills, gave a reluctant nod. As the heavy shackles fell away with a clang, the woman rubbed her raw wrists, her gaze never leaving Mason's face. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty pierced the fierce armor of her eyes. "She's not an animal." Mason said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "She's a human being." He extended a hand toward her, not touching, merely offering. "Come. My wagon's this way." To everyone's surprise, including perhaps her own, the woman followed him without resistance, walking with her head held high, despite her ragged appearance and the hostile whispering stares of the townsfolk. As they reached his wagon, heavily loaded with supplies, Mason helped her onto the seat, ignoring the murmurs and glares from the crowd. He untied his horse from the back of the wagon and mounted. "Can you drive?" he asked her. She gave a single sharp nod. "Then follow me. It's a long ride to Whispering Pines." As they left the suffocating judgment of Silver Springs behind, the woman held the reins with a surprising innate skill, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Only when the town had completely disappeared from view did she speak, her voice rough and cracked from disuse. "Why?" Mason didn't pretend to misunderstand the single loaded question. "Because what they were doing back there was wrong." "Not your problem?" She countered, her words clipped and wary. "I made it my problem." He studied her profile for a moment, the high cheekbones, the stubborn set of her jaw. "I know you're innocent, Abigail Rossi." Her head whipped around, pure shock, shattering the careful neutrality of her expression. The wagon swerved slightly before she corrected its course with an expert flick of the reins. "How? How do you know that name?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "No one has called me that in 7 years." "Because I knew your father, Lorenzo Rossi." Mason's voice softened, a note of old grief coloring his tone. "He was a friend." The woman Abigail stared at him as though he had suddenly grown a second head. Then her eyes narrowed with a suspicion born of years of betrayal. My father had no friends in this territory, only enemies who wanted what he found. I wasn't from this territory when I knew him. We met in Colorado in '72. He was surveying for the railroad company I worked for. A brilliant man. He spoke about his daughters often, Isabella and little Abigail. She flinched at the mention of her sister's name, her knuckles whitening on the reins. If you're trying to trick me... I have no reason to trick you, Mason interrupted gently. Your father saved my life during a rock slide. I owed him a debt I could never repay. When I heard rumors of a red-haired devil woman living in the canyons, I wondered if it might be one of Lorenzo's daughters. It took me years to confirm it. Abigail fell silent, her mind a whirlwind of warring emotions, deep-seated suspicion, battling a desperate, long-dormant desire to believe him. What happened to your family wasn't an accident, Abigail. And you didn't kill that bounty hunter. Her green eyes, so fiercely guarded, suddenly shimmered with unshed tears. She blinked them back with a force of will that was almost painful, her jaw tightening. Who are you? She asked finally. Mason Blackwood. I own the Whispering Pines Ranch about a 5-hour ride from here. And what do you want from me? The question hung between them, heavy with the weight of her 7 years of survival, of learning the hard lesson that nothing ever came without a price. Nothing, Mason answered simply. Okay, I want to give you a safe place to stay while we figure out how to clear your name. After that, what you do is your choice. Abigail studied him for a long, silent moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her attention back to the road ahead, her posture still rigid, with a distrust that had become as much a part of her as her own skin. I've heard that before. She said softly, the words spoken more to herself than to him. Mason didn't press further. They rode on in silence as the setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the jagged peaks in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, casting long shadows that crept like thieves across the valley floor. Two strangers bound by the ghost of a man long dead, heading toward an uncertain future. Whispering Pines. Ranch emerged from the gathering dusk, like a sanctuary carved from the wilderness itself. A sprawling collection of sturdy, well-maintained buildings nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills that gave the place its name. A large 2-story main house stood at its center, built from locally quarried stone and timber that had weathered to a handsome, silvery gray. Nearby stood a substantial barn, a bunkhouse, and various outbuildings, all speaking of a prosperity earned through relentless hard work. As they approached, Abigail tensed visibly, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, instinctively calculating escape routes, assessing potential threats with the hyper-aware senses of a cornered animal. No one will harm you here, Mason said quietly, noticing her reaction. She didn't acknowledge his words, her focus remaining locked on their surroundings. A tall black man emerged from the barn, followed by a lanky teenage boy, who hung back watching their approach with a wary curiosity that mirrored Abigail's own. The man approached with measured, confident steps, his weathered face breaking into a smile of welcome for Mason that quickly turned to surprise when he spotted Abigail. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his deep voice tinged with the soft cadence of the South. "Wasn't expecting you back with company." Ezra Mason nodded in greeting. "This is Abigail Rossi. She'll be staying with us for a while." If Ezra Collins recognized the name, or found anything unusual about the ragged, guarded woman sitting on the wagon, he gave no indication. He simply touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of quiet respect. "Miss Rossi, welcome to Whispering Pines." Abigail stared at him, clearly startled by the simple, courteous greeting. "Ezra is my foreman," Mason explained. "He runs this place better than I do, truth be told." Mr. Blackwood exaggerates, Ezra replied with a small wry smile. But I do keep things in order when he's away. He gestured to the boy hovering near the barn door. That's Noah, Mr. Blackwood's son. The boy, no more than 16, ducked his head when Abigail's gaze landed on him. He had his father's striking blue eyes, but none of his quiet confidence. His thin frame was almost hunched, as though he were constantly trying to make himself smaller to become invisible. Noah Mason called gently, "Come say hello to our guest." The boy approached reluctantly, his eyes fixed on the ground. He stopped a few paces away, giving a quick, jerky nod that might have been a greeting before retreating back toward the shadows of the barn without uttering a single word. "My son doesn't speak much," Mason said, a shadow of deep pain crossing his face. "Not anymore." Before Abigail could respond, if she had planned to, the door of the main house opened, and a stout Mexican woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense air emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Poor Finn. I thought you'd been swallowed by that town," she called to Mason, her accent thick, but her English clear. Her dark eyes widened when she spotted Abigail. "Yesta." "Sophia, this is Abigail Rossi. She'll be staying with us for a while." Mason's tone held a note of affection. "Abigail, this is Sophia Martinez, the best cook in the territory, and the reason we're all still alive." Sophia studied Abigail with undisguised curiosity, taking in her ragged appearance and fiercely guarded posture. Then, to Abigail's evident surprise, she simply nodded. "You look half-starved, Nina. Come inside. Dinner is almost ready." Abigail remained frozen beside the wagon, overwhelmed by the casual, unquestioning acceptance of these strangers. "You must be tired," Mason said, his voice gentle but not pitying. "Sophia will show you where you can clean up before dinner." Still, Abigail hesitated, her deeply ingrained instinct for self-preservation warring with a bone-deep exhaustion and the seductive promise of safety. "The room has a lock," Mason added quietly, showing an uncanny understanding of her fears. "And a separate door to the outside. You're not a prisoner here, Abigail." Something in his tone, not condescension, but a genuine understanding, seemed to finally reach her. She gave a short, abrupt nod and followed Sophia toward the house, maintaining a careful distance between herself and the older woman. As they disappeared inside, Ezra turned to Mason, a single eyebrow raised in a silent question. "The red-haired devil?" he asked, his voice pitched low. Mason nodded, unsurprised that Ezra knew. Little happened in the territory that the foreman didn't eventually hear about. She's Lorenzo Rossi's daughter. Understanding dawned in Ezra's eyes. The Italian surveyor, the one who found that gold deposit up in Red Rock Canyon. The same. Folks said his whole family was killed by Apaches. That's what folks were meant to believe. Mason's jaw tightened. She's been surviving on her own for 7 years, Ezra. Hunted like an animal for a crime she didn't commit. Ezra absorbed this information with the thoughtful silence of a man who had seen too much of the world's injustice to be shocked by one more example. "Thornton's involved, I take it?" "Up to his neck, if I had to guess." The foreman nodded slowly. "We'll need to keep sharp eyes out. That man doesn't let go of grudges easily." "No," Mason's hand unconsciously moved to the scar on his cheek. "He doesn't. Have someone watch the North Ridge at night. That's the most likely approach if they come. Already planning on it." Ezra glanced toward the house. "Does she know why you've brought her here?" "The real reason?" "Not all of it. She's not ready to trust anyone yet." Mason ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking every one of his 38 years. "Hell, I'm not sure she'll ever trust anyone again after what she's been through." "Time will tell," Ezra said philosophically. "Meanwhile, you should go check on Noah. He was upset when you didn't return yesterday. Mason nodded, his expression softening at the mention of his son. How has he been? Same as always. Spends most of his time with the horses. That new Mustang you brought in last month has taken a shine to him. At least the horses talk back to him in their own way, Mason said with a sad smile. I'll go find him now. As Mason headed toward the barn, Ezra called after him. Boss, this is going to stir up trouble. You sure it's worth it? Mason paused, looking back at his foreman, his face illuminated by the rising moon. Her father once told me, a debt unpaid is a chain around your soul. I've been carrying those chains for 10 years, Ezra. It's time to break them one way or another. Sophia led Abigail to a small but immaculately clean room off the kitchen. It contained a narrow bed with fresh linens, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, a simple chest of drawers, and a rocking chair by the window. As promised, there was a sturdy lock on the inside of the door and another door that led directly outside to a small private porch. Bathroom is down the hall, Sophia said, her tone matter-of-fact. I'll bring hot water for washing. There's a dress in the chest that might fit you. Belongs to Dr. Reed when she stays over sometimes. Abigail stood in the center of the room, unwilling to touch anything with her filthy hands, unable to process the simple kindness of these arrangements. Why she asked finally the same question she had posed to Mason. Sophia turned, studying her with shrewd eyes that had seen much of life's cruelty and its joy. Why what, Nina? Why are you helping me? You know who they say I am. They say many things in this territory. Most of it is basura. Garbage. Sophia shrugged. Mr. Blackwood is a good judge of character. If he brought you here, he has his reasons. You trust him that much? With my life, Sophia replied without a moment's hesitation. 5 years ago, my sons were killed by border raiders. My village. They blamed me. Said I brought bad luck. Mr. Blackwood found me half dead on the trail and brought me here. He never asked for anything in return except honest work. She stepped closer, her gaze direct, but not unkind. Whatever you've done to survive, Nina, it does not matter here. At Whispering Pines, we all have our ghosts. We just learn to live with them. With that, she left, closing the door softly behind her. Alone for the first time since her capture, Abigail's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. Her legs gave way, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, her body trembling with the violent aftershocks of fear, exhaustion, and profound confusion. 7 years of constant vigilance had left her utterly unprepared for kindness. When Sophia returned with the promised hot water, she found Abigail still sitting rigidly on the bed, her eyes fixed on the window and the darkening sky beyond. Dinner in 30 minutes, Sophia said, setting down the steaming pitcher. You come or not, it is your choice. But my stew is worth eating even for wild things like you. After the older woman left, Abigail approached the washstand cautiously, as though it might be a trap. She poured water into the bowl, the steam rising with the scent of something floral. Soap, she realized, a luxury she had almost forgotten. Slowly, methodically, she began to wash away 7 years of wilderness living. Watching the water turn gray, then black, she scrubbed until her skin was pink and raw, as though she could erase not just the dirt, but the memories, the fear, the constant grinding fight for survival. In the small cracked mirror above the washstand, a stranger stared back at her. A gaunt woman with sharp cheekbones and hollow, haunted eyes. Her red hair was a tangled, hopeless mess, despite her attempts to comb it with her fingers. 7 years ago, she had been a girl of 18, soft with youth and innocence. That girl was gone forever, replaced by this hard-eyed survivor who trusted nothing and no one. The dress Sophia had mentioned lay folded in the chest. A simple blue cotton garment, it hung loose on Abigail's thin frame, but it was cleaner than anything she had worn in years. She fingered the fabric with a sense of wonder, the simple pleasure of clean clothes almost overwhelming. A soft knock at the door made her flinch, her hand automatically reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. "Dinner's ready," came Sophia's voice. "Come eat." Abigail hesitated, torn between the gnawing ache of hunger and the deep-seated caution that had kept her alive. Finally, hunger won out. She hadn't eaten since before her capture, and her body's demands could no longer be ignored. She unlocked the door cautiously, half expecting to find armed men waiting to seize her. Instead, there was only the rich, savory smell of hearty stew and fresh-baked bread wafting from the kitchen. The large farm table was set for 5, with Mason already seated at its head. Ezra sat to his right, while Sophia bustled about, placing a large steaming pot in the center of the table. Noah slipped in quietly, taking a seat as far from his father as possible, his eyes darting nervously around the room. All activity ceased when Abigail appeared in the doorway. She stood frozen, a wild creature poised for flight at the first sign of a threat. "Join us," Mason said, simply gesturing to an empty chair. Abigail remained where she was, her gaze flicking from face to face, assessing, calculating. "Food's getting cold," Sophia announced, her gruff tone breaking the tension. "Sit or don't sit, but decide quickly." Something about the woman's no-nonsense attitude eased Abigail's paralysis. She moved to the table, deliberately choosing the seat closest to the door, her back to the wall, a position that allowed her to watch everyone and keep her escape route clear. Sophia ladled stew into bowls, the rich aroma making Abigail's stomach clench with hunger. Still, she didn't touch her food, watching as the others began to eat. Mason noticed her hesitation and understood its cause. Without drawing attention to it, he reached over, took a spoonful of stew from her bowl, and ate it himself. The gesture was a simple, silent reassurance that the food was safe. Abigail waited a moment longer, then picked up her spoon. The first taste of the hearty stew, rich with meat, vegetables, and savory spices, nearly undid her. She hadn't realized how accustomed she'd become to a diet of foraged roots, raw meat, and the constant gnawing edge of hunger that had been her companion for 7 years. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to bolt the food like a starving animal, though that is exactly what she was. As she ate, she listened to the quiet, mundane conversation around the table. Ezra reporting on the day's work, Mason asking about a specific line of cattle, Sophia complaining about a shortage of flour. Normal talk, safe talk. Nothing about the wild woman they had welcomed to their table. "That Mustang's coming along," Ezra said, glancing at Noah. "Your boy's got away with him. Gentlest hand I've ever seen with a horse that's spirited." Noah ducked his head at the praise, a flush creeping up his neck, but he didn't speak. "That doesn't surprise me," Mason replied, a fond, sad look on his face. Noah's always had a gift for understanding creatures that can't use words. Abigail watched the interaction with guarded curiosity. The boy's silence seemed to be an accepted fact of life here. But there was an undercurrent of deep sorrow in the way Mason looked at him, as though remembering a different child from a different, happier time. "Miss Rossi," Ezra said suddenly, turning his attention to her. "You've lived in the wilderness for some time. Ever encounter that pack of wolves that's been troubling our south pasture?" Abigail tensed at being directly addressed, her hand tightening on her spoon. But the question wasn't threatening. It was conversational, treating her unusual background as a potential source of useful information rather than a mark of savagery. "Gray wolves," she said, her voice still rough. 5 adults, 3 cubs born this spring. They hunt mainly deer and rabbits. They stay away from humans unless they're threatened. Ezra nodded thoughtfully. "That matches what I've observed." They took a calf last month, though. Probably because their usual hunting grounds were disrupted by the logging operation in Weber's Canyon. Abigail replied, then fell silent, surprised by her own willingness to engage. Makes sense, Ezra agreed. Wolves don't change their habits without a reason. The conversation flowed around her again, neither demanding her participation nor excluding her. It was peaceful, a word whose meaning she had almost forgotten. As the meal concluded, Mason finally addressed her directly. Abigail, tomorrow, we can talk more about why I brought you here. For tonight, rest. You're safe. She met his gaze, measuring the truth in his words. No one's safe, she replied softly. Not really. A shadow crossed Mason's face, a recognition of a truth he couldn't deny. Perhaps not. But tonight you have walls around you, a lock on your door, and people who will stand between you and any harm. It's more than you had yesterday. Abigail couldn't argue with that. She nodded once, then rose from the table. Thank you for the meal, she said to Sophia, the words rusty with disuse, but sincere. De nada. Now sleep well. As Abigail retreated to her room, Mason watched her go, his expression troubled. She reminds me of that Mustang when we first brought her in, Ezra observed quietly. Wild, yes, but more than that. Wounded, in ways you can't see. Some wounds never fully heal. Mason replied, his hand unconsciously moving to the scar on his cheek. But they can become bearable. With time. In her room, Abigail stood by the window, looking out at the star-dusted landscape. For 7 years she had slept under these same stars, but always with one eye open, always alert for danger. The softness of the bed behind her was an almost forgotten luxury, yet she hesitated to surrender to its comfort. Finally, she dragged the blanket and pillow to the floor in the corner of the room, positioning herself where she could see both doors and the window. She laid her head down, one hand, clutching a butter knife she had quietly slipped from the table. A poor weapon, but better than nothing. As exhaustion finally claimed her, Abigail's last coherent thought was that she didn't understand these people or their kindness. But for the first time in 7 long years, she might allow herself a few hours of true sleep. The Arizona night was still, the air thick with the scent of pine and cooling earth. Long after the rest of the household had retired, a single lamp burned low in Mason's study. He sat at his large oak desk, an old journal open before him, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. He turned the pages slowly, his fingers tracing the neat, methodical handwriting of a man 10 years dead. April 12, 1872. Found promising geological formations in the North Canyon. If my suspicions are correct, this could be the richest gold deposit discovered in this territory. Must proceed with caution. Too many hungry eyes watching. Mason sipped from a glass of whiskey, his eyes distant with memory. Lorenzo Rossi had been a brilliant, meticulous man, but tragically naive about the depths of human greed. He had believed in science and progress, in the fundamental decency of his fellow man. That belief had cost him everything. A soft knock at his study door interrupted his thoughts. He closed the journal quickly, sliding it into a drawer, before calling out, "Come in." Ezra entered, his expression grave. "Rider coming in from town. Looks like Dr. Reed." Mason frowned. At this hour, something must be wrong. He rose and followed Ezra to the front porch, where they watched a lone horse and rider approaching at a steady, determined pace. As they drew closer, the figure resolved into a woman in a dark riding habit, her posture straight and confident, despite what must have been a long and tiring journey. Eleanor Mason called as she reined in her horse. "What brings you out here so late?" Dr. Eleanor Reed dismounted with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent more time in a saddle than was considered proper for a lady of her standing. At 40, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down prejudice and emerged stronger for it. Her brown hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back in a practical bun, her intelligent eyes taking in the scene before her with a physician's sharp assessment. "I came as soon as I heard Mason," she said, her voice pitched low. "Is it true? You bought the red-haired devil at auction?" Mason's expression tightened. "Her name is Abigail Rossi. And yes, I did." Eleanor studied him for a moment, then nodded as though confirming something to herself. "Lorenzo Rossi's daughter. I thought as much when I heard the descriptions, but I couldn't be certain." "You knew Lorenzo?" Mason asked, surprised. "I treated his wife for consumption shortly before the tragedy." Eleanor's gaze was direct and unflinching. "Those girls didn't die in an Apache raid, did they?" "No," Mason replied grimly. "They didn't." Eleanor sighed, removing her riding gloves. "I need to examine her, Mason. From what I heard, she's been living wild for years. There could be any number of health concerns." "She's only just started to trust us, Eleanor. A medical examination might undo that progress." "Better to undo progress than to miss an infection or an illness that could kill her." Eleanor's tone was firm but compassionate. "I'll be gentle, I promise. And it might help that I'm a woman." Mason considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "She's in the guest room off the kitchen. But let me speak to her first." They entered the house quietly, mindful of the late hour. Mason knocked softly on Abigail's door, not surprised when there was no immediate answer. "Abigail," he called softly. "It's Mason. Dr. Reed is here. She'd like to check you for any injuries or illness. May we come in?" Silence stretched for a long moment before the lock clicked and the door opened a crack. Abigail's green eyes, alert and wary despite the late hour, assessed them from the darkness. "I'm not sick," she said flatly. "Perhaps not." Eleanor replied, her professional demeanor tempered with genuine concern. "But you've been through an ordeal, and I'd like to make sure you are physically well. I won't do anything without your permission." Abigail hesitated, then opened the door wider, allowing them to enter. Mason noticed that she had made a nest of blankets on the floor in the corner rather than using the bed, and that she kept a firm grip on what appeared to be a butter knife. He chose not to comment on either observation. "I'll leave you with Dr. Reed," he said, backing toward the door. "She's a friend. You can trust her." Abigail's expression suggested that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but she gave a curt nod. Once Mason had left, Eleanor set her medical bag on the table and turned to Abigail with a kind but professional smile. "I knew your father briefly," she said, as she began unpacking her instruments. "He was a good man, very proud of his daughters." Abigail's expression flickered with surprise before settling back into guarded neutrality. "I'd like to check your lungs, your heart, and look for any injuries that might need treatment," Eleanor continued. "Is that acceptable?" After a moment's consideration, Abigail gave a short nod. Eleanor's examination was thorough, but gentle. She listened to Abigail's breathing, checked her reflexes, examined the bruises from her capture, and disinfected several small cuts. Throughout, she maintained a soothing monologue, explaining what she was doing and why treating Abigail with the same respect she would show any of her patients. "You're malnourished," she concluded finally. "But that's to be expected given your circumstances. A few weeks of regular meals should help. The bruises will heal on their own. Otherwise, you're remarkably healthy for someone who's been living rough for so long." Abigail accepted this assessment without comment, but some of the tension had left her shoulders during the examination. Eleanor's matter-of-fact approach and lack of judgment had eased her initial wariness. "May I ask how you survived out there for 7 years?" Eleanor asked as she packed up her instruments. "From a medical perspective, it's quite extraordinary." Abigail seemed to weigh the question, searching for hidden motives. Finding none, she replied simply, "I watched. I learned. I adapted." "Remarkable," Eleanor murmured. "Most people wouldn't have lasted a month." "Most people give up too easily." Eleanor smiled at that. "I suspect you're right." She closed her bag with a decisive click. "Well, Miss Rossi, physically you're on the mend. As for the rest, time is often the best medicine." As she turned to leave, Abigail spoke again, her voice barely audible. "They said I killed a man, a bounty hunter." Eleanor paused, looking back. "And did you?" "No." Abigail's green eyes burned with a sudden fierce intensity. "I've stolen to survive. I've threatened when cornered. But I have never taken a human life." The doctor studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you," she said simply. "And for what it's worth, I suspect Mason does too. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here." After Eleanor left, Abigail returned to her nest of blankets in the corner, her mind whirling with the day's events. From captured fugitive to what guessed charity case? She didn't understand Mason Blackwood's motivations. But for tonight, at least, she was safe-fed and had been treated with a respect she hadn't experienced in years. Sometime in the deep, silent hours before dawn, she was jolted awake by a sound, a cry quickly muffled. Abigail rose silently, the butter knife clutched in her hand. She listened intently, her wilderness-honed senses identifying the source as somewhere upstairs. After a moment's hesitation, driven by a curiosity that overrode her caution, she crept from her room and down the hallway following the sound. The main staircase creaked slightly under her weight, but she moved with the stealth of a predator, placing each foot with meticulous care. At the top of the stairs, she paused, orienting herself toward the noise. A whimpering sound punctuated by words she couldn't quite make out. A door stood slightly ajar at the end of the hallway, a thin line of moonlight spilling from it. Abigail approached cautiously, peering through the crack. Inside, illuminated by the silver light streaming through an open window, she saw Mason seated on the edge of a bed. He was bent over the form of his son Noah, who was thrashing in the grip of what appeared to be a violent nightmare. "Shh, it's all right," Mason was murmuring, his voice impossibly gentle as he stroked the boy's hair. "You're safe, Noah. It's just a dream." The boy's eyes flew open, wild with a terror that seemed to go far beyond a simple bad dream. He scrambled backward against the headboard, his mouth opening in a silent, desperate scream. "It's me, son," Mason said, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "It's just your father. You're home. You're safe." Recognition slowly dawned in Noah's eyes. He relaxed marginally, though his breath still came in ragged, painful gasps. "The same dream?" Mason asked softly. Noah nodded, pulling his knees to his chest, making himself as small as possible. "It wasn't your fault, Noah. You have to believe that." The pain in Mason's voice was raw, unguarded. "Your mother's death. It wasn't your fault." Noah turned his face away, his thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mason reached out hesitantly, as if to comfort him, then withdrew his hand when Noah flinched. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words heavy with a father's helpless grief. "I wish I knew how to help you." The scene was so intensely private, so deeply personal, that Abigail felt like a trespasser. She backed away as silently as she had come, retreating downstairs to the relative safety of her room. As she curled back into her blankets, Abigail found herself troubled by what she had witnessed. Mason Blackwood, the confident rancher who had stood up to an entire town, had looked broken in that upstairs room. and his son trapped in a silence that seemed to be both a choice and a prison haunted by the ghost of a mother's death. Everyone has their ghosts, Sophia had said. At Whispering Pines, it seemed those ghosts were as real and as present as the living. Dawn broke over Whispering Pines. In a spectacular array of pinks and golds, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the tall pines that gave the ranch its name. The air was cool and sweet with their scent. Abigail woke instantly, her body alert, as always, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before memory rushed back. She rose and dressed quickly in the blue cotton dress, though she found herself longing for the practical, if ragged, trousers she had worn for years. A dress was confining and impractical for quick movement or self-defense. But it was clean, and for now, that was enough. The kitchen was already a hub of activity when she emerged. Sophia worked at the large cast-iron stove, the smell of coffee bacon and fresh-baked bread filling the air. Ezra sat at the table discussing the day's work with two ranch hands Abigail hadn't met the night before. They fell silent when she appeared, their eyes widening with a mixture of recognition and curiosity. "Ah, you're up," Sophia said, glancing over her shoulder. "Sit, eat. Coffee's hot." Abigail hesitated, uncomfortable under the stares of the ranch hands. "Jim Pete, this is Miss Rossi," Ezra said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's Mr. Blackwood's guest. You make her welcome." The older of the two men, his face weathered by years of sun and wind, touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Mom." The younger one continued to stare until Ezra cleared his throat pointedly. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Welcome to Whispering Pines." Abigail nodded awkwardly, unused to such courteous treatment after years of being viewed as little more than an animal. She took the same seat she had occupied at dinner, back to the walleyes on the room. Sophia placed a plate before her piled high with eggs, bacon, and a thick slice of fresh bread with honey. Abigail's mouth watered at the sight, but she waited until the others had begun eating before touching her food, still wary, despite the previous night's meal passing without incident. Mason entered a few minutes later, looking tired but composed. If he had spent much of the night comforting his son, it showed only in the slight shadows beneath his eyes. "Good morning," he said, his gaze touching briefly on Abigail before moving to the others. "Jim Pete, I want you both riding the north boundary today. Keep an eye out for strangers." The men nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. "Where's Noah?" Mason asked, accepting a cup of coffee from Sophia. "Already in the barn," Ezra replied. "That boy rises with the birds." Mason's expression softened with a mixture of pride and sadness. "He always has." As the men finished their breakfast and departed for their day's work, Mason turned his full attention to Abigail. "If you're feeling up to it, I'd like to show you the ranch today. Help you get your bearings." Abigail regarded him cautiously, the food in her stomach a warm counterpoint to the cold knot of suspicion that remained. "Why am I here, Mr. Blackwood, really?" Mason considered her for a moment, then nodded, as though he'd come to a decision. "Let's talk in my study. It's more private." He led her to a room off the main hallway, a comfortable masculine space lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk. Maps of the territory covered one wall, marked with notations Abigail couldn't decipher from a distance. Mason closed the door behind them, then moved to a cabinet from which he withdrew the journal Abigail had glimpsed the night before. "This belonged to your father," he said, placing it on the desk between them. His survey journal from 1872 and 73. Abigail stared at the book, her hand reaching out involuntarily before she pulled it back. "How did you get this?" "Lorenzo gave it to me for safekeeping shortly before he was killed. He suspected he was being watched, that his discovery was too valuable to remain secret for long." "The gold," Abigail said softly. "In Red Rock Canyon." Mason looked up sharply. "You know about that?" "I overheard my father and Isabella talking the night before." She swallowed hard, the memory still raw, still sharp as broken glass. Before they came, men with torches. They killed my parents, burned our home. Isabella and I were hidden in the root cellar. We heard everything. Mason's expression darkened with a shared grief and a cold, hard anger. I'm sorry, Abigail. Lorenzo was a good man. He didn't deserve such an end. Abigail continued, her voice distant as she revisited memories long suppressed. A man found us hiding. Said he'd take us somewhere safe. But he sold us instead. To different men. Her green eyes hardened into chips of ice. I was 13. Isabella was 17. Mason's hands clenched into fists on the desk, his knuckles white. And you escaped. 3 years later, the man who bought me. She stopped, unwilling or unable to elaborate on the horrors of those years. I took his horse and I rode until it died beneath me. Then I walked. I kept walking until I found the canyons. I learned to survive. I learned to disappear. And all this time you've been blamed for crimes you didn't commit. Hunted like an animal. Mason's voice was tight with controlled rage. While Wallace Thornton grew rich from your father's discovery. Built an empire on stolen gold and murdered innocents. Abigail's head snapped up at the name. Thornton, the man from the auction. The same. He's controlled this territory for years through violence and intimidation. Few dare to stand against him. But you do, Abigail observed, studying him with a new and intense interest. Why? Mason's hand moved unconsciously to the scar on his cheek. Let's just say Thornton and I have history. Bad blood. He leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. Abigail, I brought you here because I believe that together we can bring Thornton to justice. For your family. For the others he's harmed. For the bounty hunter whose death you're blamed for. Why would anyone believe me? I'm the red-haired devil, remember, a savage, a murderer. Because we'll find proof, Mason replied firmly. Your father's journal contains coordinates, geological surveys, evidence that Thornton's gold mine rightfully belongs to you and your sister. And I have connections with the territorial governor. If we can build a strong enough case... My sister is dead, Abigail interrupted flatly. She didn't escape like I did. Mason frowned at her certainty. Are you sure there was no body found? She would have found me if she were alive. Isabella wouldn't have abandoned me. The certainty in Abigail's voice brooked no argument, though a flicker of doubt, a ghost of a long-dead hope, crossed her face for a barest moment. Perhaps Mason conceded gently. But Abigail, this is your chance for justice, for reclaiming your name and your birthright. Will you help me? Abigail sat in silence, absorbing his words, searching his face for any sign of deception, and finding none. Finally, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since her arrival. What do you get out of this, Mr. Blackwood? Why risk everything for a stranger? Mason was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window and the pine-covered hills beyond. When he spoke, his voice was soft with memory. 10 years ago, your father saved my life during a rock slide in Colorado. When I asked him how I could ever repay him, he said, if ever my family needs help, you'll know your debt. Later, after I moved to Arizona, I heard rumors about the Rossi massacre. By then, it was too late to save your parents, but I never stopped looking for their daughters. He turned back to her, his expression solemn. I don't expect you to trust me, Abigail. You've survived this long by trusting no one. But I'm asking you to work with me, to use your knowledge of the canyons and your father's journal to build a case against Thornton. After that, whether you stay or go is entirely your choice." Abigail sat in silence, the weight of his words settling over her. For 7 years she had lived by her wits and her instincts, viewing all other humans as threats to be avoided or overcome. The idea of an alliance, of a shared purpose, was as foreign to her now as the soft bed and clean clothes. "I need time," she said finally, "to think." Mason nodded, accepting her caution as reasonable. "Of course. In the meantime, the offer to show you the ranch still stands. It might help to know your surroundings." After a moment's consideration, Abigail agreed with a short nod. She needed to map escape routes to understand the terrain around her. Survival habits were too deeply ingrained to abandon regardless of Mason's apparent sincerity. They left the study together, stepping out into the bright morning sunlight. As they crossed the yard toward the barn, Abigail became aware of someone watching them. She turned her head sharply, spotting Noah half hidden in the barn doorway, his blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that belied his youth. When he realized she had noticed him, he ducked back into the shadows of the barn, disappearing like a startled deer. "Noah's curious about you," Mason observed, having noticed the exchange. "That's more interest than he's shown in anything except horses for a long time." "What happened to him?" Abigail asked before she could stop herself. "Why doesn't he speak?" Mason's steps faltered slightly, a familiar pain flashing across his features. 3 years ago, my wife Catherine took her own life. Noah found her. He hasn't spoken a word since that day. The stark, brutal admission hung in the air between them, a glimpse of the profound grief that haunted Whispering Pines. "I'm sorry," Abigail said awkwardly, unused to offering comfort. Mason acknowledged her words, with a slight pained nod. The mind protects itself as it can. Some wounds leave no visible scars. He glanced at her, a deep understanding in his gaze. "I suspect you know something about that." Before Abigail could respond, the peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders coming fast. Mason's expression hardened instantly as he moved instinctively to stand in front of Abigail. "Get to the house," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Find Ezra." But it was too late for retreat. 5 riders thundered into the yard, dust billowing around them as they reined in their mounts with a jangle of bridles and spurs. At their head rode Sheriff Harlow Montgomery, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. Beside him, a triumphant smirk twisting his fleshy face, was Wallace Thornton. Mason Blackwood Montgomery called his voice carrying across the yard with a false authority. "I have a warrant for the arrest of the fugitive, known as the Red-Haired Devil. She's charged with escape from lawful custody and the murder of Travis Hodge." Mason stepped forward, his stance casual, but his eyes as sharp and cold as ice. "There's no fugitive here, Harlow. Just my guest, Miss Abigail Rossi, whose freedom I purchased legally yesterday. Or have you forgotten the auction you yourself conducted?" Montgomery flushed slightly. "New evidence has come to light." "Oh, and what evidence might that be?" Mason's tone was dangerously pleasant. "Let me guess." Mr. Thornton suddenly remembered some crucial detail. Thornton urged his horse forward. "Watch your tone, Blackwood. The sheriff is just doing his duty." "His duty," Mason laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Is that what you call it?" By now, Ezra had emerged from the bunkhouse, a rifle held casually at his side. 2 other ranch hands appeared from the barn, positioning themselves to flank the visitors. The atmosphere crackled with a tension that was almost palpable. "I have the bill of sale," Mason continued evenly. "Signed by you, Sheriff, transferring all claim on Miss Rossi to me in exchange for $500. Unless you're planning to refund that money, I suggest you take your warrant and leave my property." Montgomery shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "The law's the law, Mason." Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The law. Mason's voice hardened. Was it the law that condemned an innocent woman without a trial? Was it the law that looked the other way when Lorenzo Rossi and his wife were murdered for discovering gold on their own property? A ripple of unease passed through the sheriff's men. Thornton's face darkened with anger. "You're treading on dangerous ground, Blackwood," he snarled. "Very dangerous ground." "I've been on dangerous ground since the day I moved to this territory," Mason replied coldly. "Nothing new there." Throughout this exchange, Abigail had stood slightly behind Mason, taking in every detail, calculating odds, planning escape routes. Now she stepped forward, her green eyes blazing with a fury that had been suppressed for 7 long years. "I remember you, Thornton," she said, her gaze fixed on him, a predator locking onto its prey. "You were there, the night my parents died. You gave the order." Thornton's expression flickered momentarily before settling back into a contemptuous sneer. The devil woman's delusional sheriff. Further proof she's dangerous and belongs behind bars. Or better yet, at the end of a rope. "You know, I'm telling the truth," Abigail continued, her voice steady despite the rage coursing through her. "You recognized me at the auction. That's why you were so determined to buy me, to silence me permanently." "This is absurd." Thornton blustered, but his eyes darted nervously to the men around him. "Sheriff, do your duty." Montgomery hesitated, caught between Thornton's demands and the growing unease of his own deputies. Mason's quiet, unyielding stance made it clear that any attempt to take Abigail would be met with armed resistance. "The territorial governor might be interested to hear about today's events," Mason said conversationally. "Especially since I sent him a telegram yesterday, detailing Miss Rossi's situation and my concerns about corruption in Silver Springs." This was a bluff. Mason had sent no such telegram, but Montgomery paled visibly. The sheriff was a weak man, not an entirely evil one, and the prospect of official scrutiny clearly unnerved him. "This isn't over," Thornton snapped, jerking his horse's head around. "Not by a long shot. The woman's dangerous, Blackwood. She'll bring you nothing but trouble." "Trouble seems to find me regardless," Mason replied with a dangerous calm. "Good day, gentlemen." The riders departed as they had arrived in a cloud of dust and resentment. Only when they were well down the road did Mason turn to Abigail, concern replacing the cold anger in his eyes. "Are you all right?" She nodded curtly, though her hands were trembling slightly from the adrenaline rush of finally confronting her family's murderer face to face. "You just made a powerful enemy," she said quietly. "Thornton was already my enemy," Mason replied, his hand moving unconsciously to his scar. "This just raises the stakes." Ezra approached his rifle, now held more openly. "I'll double the watch tonight, boss, and send Jim to alert the hands at the north pasture." Mason nodded his agreement. Thornton won't try anything in broad daylight. But after dark, we'll be ready, Ezra assured him, then nodded respectfully to Abigail before heading toward the bunkhouse. Left alone with Mason, Abigail studied him with new eyes. He had stood between her and danger without a moment's hesitation, risking his ranch and possibly his life to protect someone he barely knew. It didn't make sense. Not in the harsh, unforgiving world she had inhabited for 7 years, where survival meant trusting no one but yourself. "Why did you do that?" she asked finally. "You could have given me to them, avoided all this trouble." Mason's blue eyes met hers directly. "Because it was the right thing to do. And because I'm tired of men like Thornton thinking they can take whatever they want without consequences." "There will be consequences," Abigail warned. "For you. For everyone here." "I know." Mason's expression was grim but determined. but some fights are worth the cost. As they stood together in the sunlit yard, the pine-scented breeze carrying the promise of the coming summer, Abigail felt something shift within her, a tiny crack in the hard shell of survival that had encased her for 7 long years. This man, this place, they represented something she had thought was lost to her forever. Hope. It was a dangerous feeling, hope. More dangerous than anger or fear or hate. Those emotions had kept her alive in the wilderness. Hope, if misplaced, could destroy her. And yet, looking at Mason Blackwood's scarred face and steady, unwavering gaze, Abigail couldn't quite extinguish the tiny flame that had kindled in her chest. For the first time in 7 years, she wasn't alone in her fight. That realization was as terrifying as it was liberating.